I really appreciate old technology and sort of procedural work. As with cars and knife making, there's almost always a procedure that you go through to fix whatever's wrong with what you're doing. Some way for me to sort of express feelings that I have through the world. When I was young, I saw a blacksmith smacking hot metal. I just sort of pointed at that and I was like, that's what I want to do.
Bladesmith.
Yes, yes. My name is Silas Blacklow. I'm 19 years old and I'm a bladesmith. I've been making knives for about 5 years. Some of the early ones were, barely knife making. I started just sort of hanging out with a couple friends. We found a big propane tank that had been cut in half, and we got a shop vac. We turned it on blow, or what we thought was blow. We filled it up with coal and sort of started banging on hot metal. Turns out we turned the vacuum on suck and destroyed the vacuum, sort of melted it all. From there, we made a couple knives together. Then I started making knives out of my parents' backyard and sort of the shed that was there. And I quickly outgrew that, moved to another space in New York. That was sort of a big barn. That was a good space as well, but that land sold, so I had to move to a third space. And now I'm at my new shop, which is nice. For the first couple months of high school, I was a straight A student, but I got very bored very quickly. I still learned plenty in class, but I absolutely despised homework. I decided that if the school was going to take all of my time throughout the day, they were not going to take all of my time throughout the night as well. So after a while, I sort of stopped putting any energy into school and stopped caring about what I was doing in school and how the people there thought of me. So after a while, I got myself into a little bit of trouble, got expelled from school. My dad said, hey, you don't have to go back to school, but you definitely got to do something. So I went to the town hall, got a DBA, and started my knife making journey. I learned primarily through YouTube, at least in the beginning. After a few years, once I was already making what I saw as a reasonable product, I took a class at the Center for Metal Arts with Nick Auger. Knife making specifically, it's a process that is repeatable. You would make a knife and then start over. It's got a lot of fire and sparks, which of course I like. Fire and sparks are great. So this knife, we started with 2 bars of alternately twisted Damascus that we cut into 4 and stacked so that they were twisting in opposite directions. Also, you shouldn't look at it. After that was forged out, I isolated the bolster and handle material from the blade material. Then I started drawing out the blade. If I were to have forged a point onto that bar, all of the 4 separate bars would have got squished together and ended up looking pretty muddy. So instead I just bent the tip up and then cut off the excess on the back. To some extent, I've sort of come to terms with the fact that I'm never going to make a perfect knife. No one's ever going to make a perfect knife. It's just, as a craftsman, right, I look at my work with craftsman's eyes, which means I only see what's wrong with them. I'll see any little wave in my edge, any corner that's not as sharp as it needs to be. But really, if I look back at what my goals were when I was younger, it was just, I wish I could make knives. So at this point, I've sort of achieved that, and I'm really happy with that. After that, there was a lot of normalizing, which is essentially just heating to 1650, 1550, or 1350 degrees, and then letting cool in air slowly. That sort of releases all of the stress that is sort of imparted on the material from forging. While the material was soft from normalizing, I used a sharp 36 grit belt. Made sure that it was all clean material. Made sure I didn't have any bad welds, delaminations, anything like that. There's at least some part of knife making for every mood that you could be in, you know? So it's sort of hard to get monotonous. If you get bored of forging, right, you could move on to grinding, or if you get bored of grinding, you could move on to finishing. I've caught my fingers in there all the time. Not particularly recently, but my knuckles are mostly torn up. I don't want to jinx it, but in the 4.5, 5 years that I've been doing knife making or bladesmithing, I haven't really got seriously injured. Like, I've ground off my knuckles, I've sliced my fingers open, I dropped one on my toe, almost chopped my toe off. But other than the cuts and scrapes and bruises, I've been pretty much clean from serious injury. And then it was time for hardening, which is usually a pretty dangerous process because you're taking a high carbon steel and bringing it from a very high temperature to a very low temperature very quickly, and quenching it in a specifically formulated quenchant. It's basically an oil of a specific viscosity that will cool down your steel at a specific rate of speed. After the hardening, it's incredibly hard, but also very brittle. So we need to mitigate the brittleness by tempering. That's bringing it up to a lower temperature, around 325, 375 degrees, for about 2 hours twice. That takes a little while, so we had to do that overnight. We did quite a lot of rough grinding post-heat treat because I left it very thick. For two reasons. One, because the multi-bar twist patterns look better the further you grind into them. Number two, I didn't want to risk any warpage. After rough grinding, I moved to finish grinding. And I moved up a grit progression in belts, going coarse to fine. During the finish grinding, I have to be very careful not to overheat the material because once I've hardened and tempered it, if I get it up past 400 degrees again, then I've essentially lost my temper. Bring it from the grinder, dip, grind, dip, grind, dip, grind, dip in water to cool it down after each pass. there's a million different things that I could constantly be changing. So I like to take time and make each knife differently. Because if I make the same knife over and over and over and over again, then whatever's wrong with that knife is going to be wrong with all the rest of them. The handle material starts out as a piece of dyed and stabilized wood. I have to drill out the recess for the tang and then fit it up to the blade. The tricky part here is that there can't be any gap between the wood, the spacer, and the steel. So I go back and forth from filing to fitting, and then filing, and then fitting, and then filing, and then fitting. At this point, I was pretty much ready for the glue up. We just mix up some high quality 2-part epoxy, pour it into the handle, squeeze all of the excess epoxy out with the tang and put the pin through the both of them just to keep them all in the right spot. Once the glue was cured, I had a block attached to my blade, so I hogged off all of the excess material with a fresh 36 grit belt. Then I moved on to a 120 grit belt just to clean up most of the 36 grit scratches. I also did a lot of hand filing to tune in the shape that I wanted for the butt and for a couple other parts of the handle. Yeah, I'll see patterns, or I'll just have a flash idea of a shape that I wanted to make. After the handle was at the rough shape that I wanted, I took it back to the grinder with a J-Flex 220 grit belt. The J-Flex belts have a really soft backing, so I can get into lots of tight corners, especially where the handle is going to be fitting nicely to your hand. Once the handle was sculpted, I moved back to the workbench to use my Trojan Horse Forge knife vise, which is a really nice tool. I stuck it in there and started doing some hand sanding. I started with the bolster transition. That's a pretty difficult part for the hand sanding because you have to maintain a flat surface or flat transition between the steel and the wood. It's pretty rough work, honestly my least favorite part of knife making, along with most other knife makers in the world. I'm always shooting for perfection, even though I'll never make it, but each day and each week that I spend in the shop, I'm getting a little bit closer, so yeah, that's all I need to keep going. It took, I believe, around 2 hours of hand sanding to get both sides done. After the hand sanding came the fun part, which was etching. I wrapped the handle in electrical tape so it wouldn't get any acid on it. I then cleaned the blade thoroughly and dipped it into a dilute solution of ferric chloride. The ferric chloride is good for depth. It sort of eats away at the material, but when you take it out, it's usually relatively black all over. So for contrast, I took it to an instant coffee solution. All right, we have a sketchy coffee setup. This is technically the wrong coffee. I'm also just gonna eyeball the amount. So I normally do this at home where I have a proper setup and the right coffee and all this stuff, but we're here today and I don't have a way of heating water. So I'm just gonna put this out in the sun for a little while and hope it helps. So I brewed it cold and then put it in the engine bay of my car for a little bit in the hopes that it would warm up. I don't know if that did anything, probably not, but we were having a good time, so. Professional knife making. This is how it works. For a visual description of how sharpening works is this is a dull knife, which means these two planes don't intersect. You bring these two planes down until they do intersect. This moment is called the apex, right? But when you're sharpening, you don't want to just get it to the apex, you want to get a little bit past the apex, just to be absolutely sure that it's sharp. Once you get it past the apex, achieved, see these little bits up top where my fingertips are the burr edge. You can run your finger down the side of the blade and feel that one side has a little ridge that you can catch your fingernail on. That's the burr. My knives do tell a little bit of a story. Other people don't often hear them, but of course there's sort of two aspects to it. There's the story of the, hardship that I went through to make the knife, the time I spent going through the processes to get it done. And there's also, I look back, I scroll back through my Instagram, the look of the knife often reflects some of the things that were going on in my life at that point in time. They look different in the winter than in the summer often, and it's pretty interesting to me, actually. The goal is always to reach for a better knife than you made last time. It's not necessarily to make the best knife in the world, because that doesn't exist, right? Each knife is good for some individual specific thing.
The fuck am I gonna cook with this? Some zucchini and some carrots. Anyway, let's see.
The knife needs to feel good and it needs to cut well before everything else. All of the aesthetics, all of the Damascus, all of the crazy handle sculpting comes after that. No matter how extravagant and over the top the knives get, hopefully they will always function at a high level of chef's knife functionality.